After a strong start today in terms of Sepkoski and Raup diagrams, they seem to have died off a bit, and I'm ashamed to say this is probably the first talk I've ever given that doesn't have a Sepkoski or Raup diagram in it, so I'm deeply ashamed about that and I apologise. So before I start, I just want to thank my collaborators on the two projects that I'm going to talk about in this talk, but also the poster that I'm presenting at this meeting on the early Toarcian event. Also thanks to my funders, the Leverhulme Trust and the Paleontological Association. And a big thank you to all the people listed here and many others who have inputted data into the paleobiology database. These people and their research students, I should say, who without such effort, these sort of global studies wouldn't really be that possible. So I'm going to talk about early Mesozoic hyperthermal events. And by early Mesozoic, in this instance, I mean the late Triassic through to the early Jurassic. This time period, we have the supercontinent Pangaea in its full extent, but it's just about to start rifting apart. And around this time, I don't know if you're aware, there's some rather large volcanic eruptions that take place. So we have the Central Atlantic magmatic province associated with the initial rifting of Pangaea. This happens in the latest Triassic. And then a little bit later, in, well, 20 million years or so later, in the early Toarcian, we get the Karoo-Ferrar large igneous province, slightly smaller than Camp. Camp's one of the biggest large igneous provinces of the Phanerozoic. The Karoo-Ferrar slightly smaller, but still quite an extensive volcanic event. So we know from previous talks all the nasty things that come about as a result of large igneous province eruptions. And one of those things is the emission of thermogenic gases like carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which then lead to greenhouse warming phases. So we call these events hyperthermals because of that. And according to these references, but maybe not according to some other talks today, we see temperature anomalies, we think, derived from various proxies, around 4 to 8 degrees Celsius above the base rates for these times during these two hyperthermal events. And associated with these two hyperthermals are two major extinction events. So we have the late Triassic mass extinction. We see about 50% of marine genera go extinct here, so about half of all life in the oceans. It's one of the big 5 mass extinction events, rather a significant one. Maybe this is probably the second biggest biodiversity loss in the marine realm in the Phanerozoic. And then the early Toarcian event, about half as severe, we think, about 25% marine genera loss, but still a rather significant loss of taxa. So what we wanted to do was look at extinction selectivity across these two events and in comparison to the background periods either side of the extinction. So we have a huge fossil occurrence database derived from the paleobiology database. It's all marine genera, marine animal genera, I should say. And with this data for each fossil occurrence, we have data on paleogeography, so latitude, paleolatitude, paleoocean basin, depositional setting, and then also ecospace data that we applied via the Bambach ecospace model, so things to do with tiering, feeding and motility. And then we performed a number of univariate and multivariate generalized linear models to predict extinction based on these ecological traits. So here are our ecological traits that we use in the models. So motility, tiering, feeding, ocean basin latitude and calcification. I should have depositional setting on there, but well, that's not there, but it should be there. And then we have various arguments, nominal variables that we use to predict extinction. So we want to ask a number of questions. So first of all, do certain ecological variables correlate with higher extinction risk during these hyperthermal events? So maybe where an organism is living, how it's feeding, how motile it is, things like that. Are any of these ecological traits selected against? There's a lot of research out there that suggests that certain ecological traits or certain ecosystems are selected against mass extinctions, whereas others might say that mass extinctions are notoriously non-selective and that it's just luck whether you survive them or not. We also wanted to look at whether there are any similar trends recorded in both of these hyperthermal events. So given the similarity in the causal mechanism, what we think, so large igneous province eruptions and then resultant environmental perturbations, we might expect to see similar traits selected against in both events. But then again, there's a massive difference in the magnitude. One's half the size of the other. There's a difference in starting conditions. They're 20 million years apart, so subtle differences in paleogeography. And also differences in where the large igneous provinces are erupting in terms of geography. So maybe there will be some differences. Do hyperthermals represent significantly different macroevolutionary regimes from the background periods either side of them? There's quite a wealth of research on looking at different selectivity between mass extinctions and normal background extinction phases. It's particularly interesting for the late Triassic extinction in that some previous research would suggest that we're not dealing with a sudden pulse of extinction, but merely a ramping up of high background rates throughout the late Triassic that does peak in the region themselves. And actually we don't see a change in the macroevolutionary regime. The same traits are selected against throughout the late Triassic, but we're just seeing an increase in magnitude which peaks in the region. So we wanted to test whether that was the case, or whether we do actually see a switch in extinction selectivity across the event. And then finally, does cosmopolitanism offer universal insurance against extinction? So it's often widely cited that a wide geographical distribution will protect a particular species from extinction, just because a wider range will result in a greater probability of maybe residing in some sort of area of refugia during an extinction event. And also a wider range is probably synonymous with a wider environmental tolerance. However, maybe during mass extinctions when we've got global environmental problems, there's nowhere to hide. So maybe a wide range will not be as effective as it would be during a sort of normal background period where we may just get isolated regional environmental catastrophes. So to answer some of these questions, do certain ecological variables correlate with higher extinction during hyperthermals? During these two, yes, they do. So during the late Triassic extinction, we get much higher extinction in the tropics than we do in the mid-latitudes. This suggests that, well, it fits well with the sort of climatic warming episode, which is strongly felt in the tropics. Maybe the tropics are becoming too hot to inhabit for certain organisms, much as we see across the Permian extinction and in the initial sort of recovery in the late Triassic. We see the reverse at the early Toarcian, where we see higher extinction in the mid-latitudes. Maybe this is due to the fact that the climate forcing wasn't quite so severe, so maybe the tropics weren't warmed as much as they were at the late Triassic. Or maybe it's more a reflection of the fact that one of the primary kill mechanisms during this event is ocean anoxia, and it's in the restricted, well-sampled basins of northwest Europe and northeast Panthalassa where we see the strongest anoxia. The only other variable that seems to correlate, or seems to predict extinction, I should say, is feeding. So feeding mechanisms employed by organisms. So we see the highest rates of extinctions at both hyperthermals, so this is the late Triassic, this is the early Toarcian event, amongst pelagic predators. Pelagic predators have high background extinction throughout all of this time period, probably due to the high turnover of cephalopods, particularly ammonoids. There's a definite significant increase in their extinction across these two hyperthermal events. When we get close to 100% extinction, that signifies that we're dealing with whole ecosystem collapse here, trophic cascades, things like that. And it's your pelagic predators that are paying the price for that at the top of the food chain. The other groups that have high extinction are our suspension feeders, but particularly those with sort of photosymbiotic affinities. So these are corals. This fits well with the idea that we see a reef crisis at both of these events, with reefs not really recovering up until the Arlenian. Again, fitting with this sort of warming episode where we know reefs do particularly badly. So the previous two slides kind of answered this already, but are there similar trends recorded at both hyperthermal events? Well, when we look at the biological characteristics of the individual organisms themselves, yes, there is. Our photosymbiotic and suspension feeders at the late Triassic extinction. Not so much the suspension feeders in the early Toarcian extinction, but definitely the photosymbiotic reef taxa. And our pelagic predators all suffering rather badly. But there's definite differences in the geography of the extinction events, where we see high extinction in the tropics at the late Triassic event, and higher extinction in the mid to high latitudes at the early Toarcian event. So even though there are some similarities between these hyperthermals, maybe the difference in the starting conditions, the difference in where the kill mechanisms are going off, as it was, maybe they have an influence in some of the selectivity patterns. So do hyperthermals represent significantly different macroevolutionary regimes from background periods? Some previous research suggests that in this case they don't, particularly in the late Triassic extinction. It's just a ramping up of extinction magnitude. Our results refute that, and we see quite a clear change in the selectivity patterns. During the Triassic background rate, there's no real biogeographical selectivity, but one thing we do see is that reef communities are rather stable through most of this, and that they then suffer extremely high extinction rates across the hyperthermal event itself. Same in the early Toarcian extinction. Again, there's not much reef activity in the early Jurassic, but the reef taxa that we do have suffer very low extinction rates during the background periods. But again, this ramps up to very high across the early Toarcian extinction. One similarity that we see in Jurassic background and the early Toarcian event is that we see higher than expected extinction in the Tethyan realm. This is probably explained by the fact that we do, in the northwest Tethys, we do get sort of bursts of anoxia throughout the lower Jurassic, of which the early Toarcian ocean anoxic event is just the most severe. So some similarity there. So does cosmopolitanism offer universal insurance against extinction? So our model for this is slightly different, where our response extinction variable is just a binomial variable. So it's either 0 for survived or 1 for extinct. And then what we can do is we can calculate the probability of extinction based on our geographic range data. So in this case, it's great circle distance in kilometres. We can take a particular great circle distance or geographic range size and then predict the probability of extinction based on that range. So for the background periods throughout this interval, a larger geographic range does give a lower probability of extinction. So our most wider ranging organisms have the lowest probability of extinction, the most narrow ranging organisms have the highest probability of extinction. This is exceedingly significant. However, across the late Triassic event, there's a few things to notice. One is that extinction probability is much higher in general. We'd expect that it's a mass extinction event. But also, the relationship is much less strong. So we still get higher extinction amongst our narrow-ranging groups, but this relationship is no longer significant. So this suggests that a wider geographic range offers much less insurance against extinction during these hyperthermal events. So we measured geographic distribution in another way as well, so latitudinal range in decimal degrees. Ignore that kilometres, that's not supposed to be there. And what we see is a similar pattern in background times. A wider latitudinal range gives a lower probability of extinction. This is an even stronger relationship than we see just in geographic range. It's probably because a wider latitudinal range is a better proxy for a wider sort of environmental or thermal tolerance than a wider geographic range, which could be spread throughout like a single latitudinal band. Exceptionally significant, as I said, the widest range intact, so a very low extinction probability. At the late Triassic event, again, we see higher extinction probabilities across the board. And again, the same relationship, so the wider latitudinal range intact have a higher probability of extinction. This time it's significant, but only just. So it's a weaker relationship than we see in background periods, but a wider latitudinal range still gives you a bit of insurance against going extinct during these events. So just to conclude, selection against feeding strategies at hyperthermals, we do see this, mainly pelagic predators going extinct. You get ecosystem collapse, trophic cascades, and then the photosymbiotic and suspension feeders, which is characteristic of the reef crisis. Selection against latitudes and basins at both hyperthermals, but these are different across the two different events, probably indicative of the different biogeographic factors at play, or geographic, I should say. The macroevolutionary regime, this is critical, it does change across the hyperthermals. We don't see any evidence for just an increase in extinction magnitude. Different things are being selected against during these events. And cosmopolitanism offers insurance against extinction during both background and mass extinctions, but it's significantly reduced across mass extinctions. But a wide latitudinal range is a better predictor of survivability than the wide geographic range in all scenarios. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Alex. Who'd like to ask a question? Nobody. Yeah.
So you said that in background extinctions, the predators also have, like cephalopods, have higher extinction rates.
Yep.
And is that in the extinction event itself, does this ratio increase, or is it constantly just...
The magnitude of, so the proportional extinction is a lot higher. So the magnitude of extinction is higher.
But relative to the other feeding mechanisms?
Well, so the increase is not as great. Is it? So you're talking about the increase in extinction from background to mass extinction?
What about the selectivity? So
the selectivity really, I guess you can say it doesn't really change there, right? That's just the magnitude increasing.
Oh, so okay. So
in terms of pelagic predators always seem to have a high turnover anyway, right? So, but it's just an increase in magnitude across the event there. The change in selectivity we see is the high extinction amongst the sessile suspension feeders, the photosymbiotic groups across the mass extinctions.